Hey Brian,
Hey, Brooke.
what is up? How are you doing lately?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing really well. I think lots of good, exciting things going on, and we're coming out of winter, so all good things from there. I much prefer the sunshine, but I have you here because I want to talk all about RxJS. And
Okay.
I have a question though, because if you think about like what RxJS is, it's like reactive programming. And so I have a question about your life in comparison to
Sure.
RxJS, because I think it'd be kind of a fun comparison. But like if you think of it that way, like what are some changes that you've had going on lately? Like things that just I don't know are good or bad, and how do you deal with the change, be that good or bad? Like tell me about all of it.
For sure. I'll give you the high level version of it, so that way we can get to the good stuff. Well, not actually the good stuff, but get to the RxJS stuff. And so, here I'll do something kind of corny. So RxJS like has notifications, right? Like error, complete, and next notifications. And I think my wife and I got kind of the biggest next notification in our lives about a year and a half ago. We found out that she was pregnant with our first. We've kind of put off having kids, if you will, but it was intentional, or whatever. And so we found out that she was pregnant, and then we had a baby girl that was born on one day before my birthday, actually. So April 11th of this year. So as of this recording, she's 9 months old, going on 10 months. And so, yeah, so we welcomed a new member to the family, and that has just been a complete whirlwind. I wasn't sure, like years ago, I think a couple years ago, even like I was pretty sure I didn't want to be a father.
Mm,
But I got to say, it's really changed my life in a super positive way. And
nice.
so I'm really digging being a dad and a new dad and getting to meet other dads and talk about all the things. So it's really exciting and fun. And so that is kind of the biggest news that we've had over the last year or so. And with that comes a lot of other notifications, a lot of error notifications.
Yep, yep.
We're figuring it out, and we're learning as best we can. And we've got some good family support and some friends and stuff. But yeah, so we're really happy, and enjoying the joys and the struggles and all of that comes with new parenthood.
Yeah. I can relate in the sense that like I'm at a place in my life where I currently don't want children. Not to say that I don't ever want children, but I just right now I'm not in that headspace. So I can relate.
For sure.
But
Yeah.
I always hear, and everybody always says that when they have kids, that becomes such, the top priority in their life. And
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that. So I'm glad that things have gone well and happy, healthy little girl. But
Yeah. So far, she's done awesome. And so she's just like so wildly active in the last month or two. She's a healthy baby. We don't say that she's large or anything like that, but she's a
yeah,
healthy baby.
nice.
And so she had a rough time just kind of like initially with like rolling over and these things. Like it's so weird. You definitely don't want to get wrapped up in it. I don't think I did, but friends are like, you're hanging out and their kids are just like rolling over, and you're like, my kid could barely roll over. Like, what's wrong with you? Come on.
Yeah, yeah.
But now she's like crawling around. She stands up on things. She can like scoot around. Like she's just moving. And so yeah, and she's just getting to know her personality is coming out. So it's really fun.
That
So
is
we're
fun.
excited.
And I will say on that note, like coming from the world of education and working with different kids,
Hmm.
like I'd always see different, they'd all come in as the same age, but every child
Hmm.
was so different. And so many of the parents would come to us and say, it's amazing that so and so reads like they do at such a high level, because we'll tell you until they were 4 years old, they couldn't even talk, so stuff like
Right.
that, where every kid just has their own path
Yeah.
into learning and progress and
Yeah, for
developing.
sure.
And I don't think it necessarily indicates anything that, oh no, there's something wrong with my kid. And I don't think that's the case. I just think it just happens differently for all of us. But
Yeah, I think that was good advice I received from another dad. Was like, just don't read too much into the numbers, because you go to the doctor and they're in this percentile and they should be doing these things. And he was kind of like, just don't get weighed down by that and just enjoy it and have fun. And she'll progress at the rate that she's meant to, and continue to support and love through that. So yeah, but now I feel like she's just like, she's just flying. she's so mobile now, which
Nice.
is cool.
Yeah. Well, fun. So, okay. Well, now that we've been updated on the doings and goings on of BrianLove, like I said, I have you here to talk about RxJS. I'm excited. We were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, that I'm by no means an RxJS expert. So I'm eager, because this episode will very much for me be a learning experience, as much as I hope it is for other people. But I have to tell you, like, when I've done these episodes, these roadmap to learning Angular episodes,
Mhm.
I've asked everybody who's been a guest on the show, what has been the hardest thing for you to learn? Or
Mhm.
what was the thing that gave you the hardest time, the biggest barrier? And every single person on the show has said RxJS.
Okay.
Whether that was with something else, but they at
Mhm.
least mentioned RxJS. And
Yeah.
I think it's just one of those things that you kind of cringe when you hear about it. And I think some of it's the hype. Like, people talk about it like it's so big and scary that it's
Mhm.
just sort of like spread. And now it has that reputation of being the scary thing, the hard thing. And it is, right?
Mhm.
But I think maybe we've blown it up a little bit more than it needs to be. And I think part of that, though, is finding the right way to teach it. Because
Mhm.
when you can teach something in the right way, all of a sudden all those barriers come down. But again,
Mhm.
that's why I have you here, because when I think of RxJS, I go back to the days when I was working at ng-conf, and
Mhm.
you'd always be putting on these workshops for
That's
RxJS,
right.
and you're doing that again. I think this is a great opportunity for you
Mhm.
to tell everybody about your workshop coming up
Mhm.
for ng-conf. So yeah, go ahead and do that. And then I want to get into our game.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think there's gonna be 2 RxJS workshops at ng-conf this coming June. So Ben Lesh is doing an intro to RxJS workshop, and then
Wow.
I'm doing the advanced RxJS workshop, which I kind of feel like it should be the other way around, which is fine. I think I just kind of have been teaching the advanced one for the last 2 or 3 conferences.
Yeah.
And so I kind of got slated into that same slot. But certainly, if you're listening and you want to learn more about RxJS, there's some great workshops at ng-conf you could sign up for in addition to your ticket for ng-conf.
Yeah.
So you got to buy the workshops, and like I said, in addition to. So the advanced RxJS workshop, it's a full day. It's very hands-on. We do about 20 exercises throughout the day. So it's not just me preaching to you about, do this, do that, and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. Because I think, certainly from a learning perspective, I'm going to show you and teach you and explain things, but then I want you to do it yourself.
Yeah.
And so you'll have an opportunity to do that. So it's a great workshop. Check it out. You can go purchase your ticket. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about RxJS.
Okay. Yeah. And I love that, first of all, because you were saying you show how to do it, and then you have other people go and practice it. And that goes back to this principle from education called it's I do, you do, we do. And you may have heard me talk about that with Thinkster.
For sure.
But it's that idea of like, I, the teacher, have all the knowledge. I'm going to show you how to do something. And then we do it together, so that you're not just thrown into the deep end of the pool. And then once we've practiced it together, then you go do it. So really good teaching model. But okay, well,
Absolutely.
I have to do our traditional game. And and the one I want to play it's actually quickly become one of my favorites. And I heard it originally on a radio station here in Utah. It's called the Radio from Hell. And I know it's awesome, but they do this little segment that I think is fun, because everybody's always asking, like, what's your favorite this? What's your favorite that? And this is not your favorite. This is what is not your favorite, and what do you want to get rid of? And so it's called Things That Must Go. And I'll tell you, like we've just come out of the holidays and
Uh-huh.
I have like tummy issues anyway. So there's a lot of foods that I can't eat anyway, but there are just two things that when I think of, if somebody says, hey, do you want like oatmeal raisin cookies or something, I'm always like, no, anything with raisins. Like that is one thing I think must go. Raisins ruin everything.
By
I don't like
themselves? What about just by the just like the old like little square pack you got when you were a kid or whatever, like just a little, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, the
just
one where
raisins?
they like come out in the huge clump.
They're all clumped together. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, those are okay. They're fine. But I mean, because they're all clumped together, it's sort of like, meh.
Nah. Is
But
it a
yeah, like
texture issue or a taste issue for you?
it's taste. It's definitely, well,
Taste?
I guess
Okay.
texture too, because I want
They're
like,
funny.
yeah. And
Wrinkly.
if I have an oatmeal cookie, I want it like crisp and hard, and I don't want this little ball of mush in there.
That's great. I love it.
So that, and then the other one is lemon. Like lemon has its place, but if you ever mix it with like I want an almond poppy seed muffin. I don't want almond lemon poppy seed. It just
Yeah.
ruins it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, those are my things that must go. Raisins and lemon in food.
It sounds like you need to open up a bakery. the
Okay.
raisinless bakery. We don't use raisins. I don't know what your tagline would be, but
Yeah, no raisins.
there you go.
Oh, if life gives you lemons, don't put them in food.
There you go. Perfect.
So,
I thought about this. I didn't take the food angle on this, though I suppose I could have, but I took the kind of like tech Twitter angle. And I know everybody's got opinions on Twitter these days, and I'm not going to go into the politics of Twitter.
right.
But what I think must go is, and this, I'm going to bridge into it. We all know that like debating JavaScript frameworks is futile. And I think that must go. Like, I think we just got to get over it, honestly. Yeah. But then the new fad, and this just happened, I think a week ago, but it's been happening for like a year or two, is debating whether like Tailwind CSS is good or bad. And it's like we've moved on. Like, I think everybody, not everybody, but I think for the most part, people that are like front end or JavaScript developers are kind of like the framework war thing is just like garbage, right? Like just do what you love to do. You have personal preferences. Like if you love Angular, go for it. If you love React, go for it. If you like whatever, solid JS or now Quick or whatever they are, like go for it. Do you? But I think now like we've reached that level of like acceptance, I think. I would like to hope so anyways. Now it's like CSS frameworks. So we've just kind of moved on to the next thing. And it's like, Tailwind is terrible. Tailwind is amazing. And it's just like, I don't know. Just let it go. I think it's got to go. So and I'm not canceling it. I'm not like saying like get rid of Tailwind or whatever. Like I think the whole like debating thing is just like, if it helps you get your job done and you're happier and you can like be either more successful or whatever that looks like for you, or spend more time with your family or whatever, like reach for the tool that works best for you and for your project. Like I'm not going to tell you whether to use Angular or Tailwind or whatnot. And so, I might have my own preferences and things, but so I think that's going to be on my list.
All right. I like it.
Debating Tailwind.
Yeah, it's a good one. I agree with that. Just, go with the flow. Let people do what works for them. So amen. Amen, brother. All right. So RxJS. I'm excited for this. I've looked forward to this for a while, but we kind of mentioned a little bit about why RxJS is sort of that like, it makes everybody kind of like hurt or cringe. But why? I want to hear your opinion on that. Like, why do you think so many developers avoid it or put off learning it?
Yeah, so I think there's probably, this is an Angular podcast. And so for Angular developers, we kind of don't have a choice. Maybe we do, but we kind of don't have a choice because RxJS is one of like I don't know, what is it, like 3 dependencies or 5 dependencies of Angular. And so for whatever reason, architecturally, one of the design decisions of the Angular team way back when was we need something that's going to handle asynchronicity, and we're going to leverage this thing called RxJS. And of course, promises existed at the time, and I think most JavaScript developers are pretty comfortable with promises, but they kind of reached for this other tool called RxJS. And I don't know why they did that. I mean, we could speculate, but they did. And so a lot of the API, or maybe not a lot, but certain portions of the API in Angular are going to give you back this thing called an observable. And I think for a lot of us, that was a brand new thing. We're like, okay, what is this? It's not a promise. I can't async await it. And then the more complicating of kind of overwhelming facet of RxJS is it's incredibly powerful in that it comes with all of these operators, but it's almost like overload, and especially in the beginning. I can remember when I was learning RxJS, you're going and you're just searching through the docs and you're like, okay, well, I got switch map, exhaust map, and cat map, and merge map. I have no idea which one I want, and I don't know why. So you just start hoping and reaching, and maybe there's somebody on your team that's like, oh, this is why you want this or that. And they do have an operator decision tree, which is a great tool to use if you've never used it on their website. But it still could be like daunting and overwhelming. And so I think that's why RxJS is and was kind of the biggest hurdle of learning Angular. Certainly, if you came from Angular JS to Angular, this was this whole new concept. Not only did TypeScript get introduced, and this was a long time ago, but TypeScript was kind of new. And then you had this whole thing called RxJS, and you didn't quite understand it and what to do with it. And I think that's okay. I think I was there, and sometimes I still am there. I'm still learning. But I think it can be perceived and it can be very overwhelming to kind of dive into it.
Yeah. And that's what I'm hoping to break down a little bit with this episode, is just making it so that it's not as overwhelming and helping people, just like with any programming. You're given a project and you look at it as a whole and it can be overwhelming, but if you break it down into little steps, all of a sudden it's doable and it's like, oh, I can do this. And that's what I want to do is make RxJS a little bit more approachable. But what was it for you when you first started learning it? Was there something in particular that was just like, man, I am not getting this? Or was it the map options or something else?
Yeah, I think that was part of it for me. I can remember before I even knew that there was such a thing as kind of these switch map, merge map, exhaust map, cat map. Before I even knew those operators existed, I remember this would have been like 2016 when I was first learning Angular, and it was still like kind of beta and coming out. Like I learned, okay, you get this thing called an observable back, and you subscribe to it to kind of get the value. It's kind of like a promise. But then sometimes like I knew that I had another observable that like I needed to get a value from that based on the value from the other one. So I kind of had to like, I need this first, then I need this. And I didn't know what to do. So I just like subscribed, got the value, and then I subscribed again and got the value. And I think at one point I had like 4 nested like subscribes in all these callback functions. And it just reminded me of like, and sorry for the language, but I think this is the term, is like callback hell in promises, right? Where you just have like nested thens, and you just kind of didn't know how to handle it. And so, yeah, I think in that beginning kind of, I was like, oh, this is really tough, but this doesn't feel right, but I got the job done. And I don't think that code exists anymore, thankfully. But that's kind of, I think, some of the struggles I had in the beginning.
Okay. And what did you do to work through those? Was it just simply just hands to the keyboard, or were there certain tips or strategies that like you found helped to make it more understandable for you?
Yeah, so certainly I think the biggest thing for me was just reading blog articles and just kind of going out and like self-learning at the time. And then eventually I got on a project with a couple other folks, and we kind of learned RxJS together. And so we were able to kind of help each other, and during like code reviews or just pairing up, kind of looking at the code and being like, oh no, well, what about this? Oh, okay, now how about that? Does that work a little bit better? Is the timing or the cancellation coming in where we want it to be? And so certainly I think kind of some self-study, but then also just kind of working with colleagues in those first kind of years, we were all learning it together, which was kind of fun and exciting. So
yeah, it's again, going back to those education terms, it's experiential learning, right? Learning with hands-on projects and stuff. So, okay. I love that though, because a lot of the episodes I've done here have all really emphasized pair programming being open, communicating with other people, not being afraid to just say, you know what, I don't understand this. Can you help me, or can we learn it together? So
Yeah, for sure.
definitely important. But all right, I think at this point though, it's important because we've already started using some keywords, some important vocabulary. Not everybody watching this is going to be coming in having experience with RxJS. What I'd really love is for us just to kind of pause for a second. And have you come up with a kind of like an elevator pitch definition of sorts for RxJS, through the years with your workshops? Do you have like a definition that just takes it from being this obscure concept to, oh, that's what it is. Okay.
Yeah, I think whenever I've taught RxJS, especially if you're kind of new to it, is first off, just for right now, take all those operators that you've heard about, even the ones that I've mentioned, and I want you to just put those on the shelf and just forget that they exist for right now, because they're there, but just don't worry about them. And instead, let's just focus on like what I would call like the primitive of RxJS, which is just the observable. And then to get to that knowledge, I always want to start with like, what are promises? So we talk about how promises are asynchronous in nature and how they either resolve or reject. So you kind of have like two paths in the code. Either you get like a success or you get a failure path, right? And so observables are really very similar to promises in that you have a success path and an error path, but you also have this idea of getting multiple values. And so you have this third notification or this third path called a completion. And that's because in promises, whether you get a success or a failure, so whether it resolves or rejects, like it is done, it is complete. But we need to have this additional signal in an observable, so we know when like we're not expecting anything else to come down the pipe, if you will. And so if you think about it in that way, observables are really not that much different than promises in that they could produce multiple values. So instead of one value, they could produce multiple values. They can still produce an error, just like a promise. And then we also have this third signal that says, hey, I'm all done. I'm not going to send you any other values. I've completed. So if we start there and we just don't worry about the operators, don't worry about subjects and all of these other things, and just say, okay, I've just got this thing called an observable, and it's just like a promise, but it's a little bit different that I can get multiple values back from it. And I have this additional notification or this additional signal called a completion signal.
Okay. And then take that even further. Like when you're talking about values, what do you mean by values? What values are we getting?
Sure. So just like a promise, it could be anything. So, a promise is asynchronous in nature, and you'll oftentimes get, when it resolves, you'll get a value, and not always. Sometimes it just resolves. But that value can really be anything. So that could be, if you think of asynchronicity in JavaScript, that could be things like network requests. That's probably the easiest thing to grok, in that we're all at some point doing some sort of fetch request. And when we do a fetch, we know it goes off to the server, and eventually and hopefully we get something back from the server. And so an observable is really kind of the same way. Except sometimes instead of just getting a single value, we might get multiple values. And so that could be something like a WebSocket, or that could be something like a stream of events, like a user entering data into an input field, or clicking on a button, or something like that, where instead of just getting one thing or one value, you're kind of getting multiple values over time.
Nice. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. That's what I was wanting, was more of that. What are we talking about with values? But perfect. Okay.
For sure.
And what do you think it solves? Like what problem is RxJS solving for us?
That's a I love this question because it's a little loaded.
It is, yes.
So it solves a problem in that, without getting into too much details, but one thing that's different, again, if we go back to let's think about observables versus promises. Promises are not cancelable. And what that means is kind of once you say, hey, go do something, hey, asynchronous, go start this thing that's going to occur over time and eventually come back with a completion or an error. You can't say, never mind, stop in the middle of it. Whereas observables give you this ability, and we call that cancellation. So you could basically say, while it's still doing something, you could say, hey, yeah, I changed my mind. Or the user changed their mind. They said stop or cancel or
Right.
whatever it is. And so you get this idea of cancellation. So that's one problem that they solve. But now that I've said that, let me just back up real quick and just clarify. There's nothing wrong with a promise. Observables are great. And I use RxJS. I also, and dare I say, I write a bit of React, and I use promises all the time.
Yeah.
And I can use async await with them, and no problem. Like promises are a great, it's a great spec or part of the API of ECMAScript and JavaScript. There's nothing wrong with a promise. So if you're thinking, oh, I got to change everything that's in my code from a promise to an observable because I get cancellation and I get all these operators. Yeah, sure, if you want to, and maybe there's a good use case for that, but I don't think you need to. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. Like, promises are fantastic. And if you're also thinking, well, what if I just take my observable and I turn it into a promise? Is that okay? I think it's fine. If you can get your job done and the team is okay with it, it's a decision that you guys have made, that you just want to take observables and get the first value or the last value from it, just go for it. And at the end of the day, be happy and get your PR in and go do what you love to do, or whatever. So I think observables definitely give us some additional functionality and some additional power, but that doesn't mean just because it's a more powerful car doesn't mean you need to throw away your reliable Toyota, Honda, or whatever and go jump in the Ferrari. You know what I mean? So, not that an observable is a Ferrari. That's maybe a bad analogy, but
I think it makes sense. And I was going to ask some questions about observables versus promises a little bit later, but I think why not now? I'd rather go off of what you're saying. So what are some times then when you would want to use a promise over observables?
Yeah, for sure. I think probably for me anyways, the simplest use case is when I want to do async await. Like I just want to get a value and I want to use async await, and I want to use kind of more of a quote unquote procedural style, code, if you will. And certainly there may be use cases when, from an API perspective, if you're developing something that another developer is going to consume and you just want to give them back a single value, just make it a promise and give them back a promise. So that way maybe it's another team, or maybe you're writing an API that's going to be used by developers around the world. That way they don't necessarily have to know what an observable is. Because I think, promises are part of the kind of built-in, they're part of the spec, they're primitive. And so I think kind of when you want to fall back to that and it makes sense, and then just do so, just keep it simple for yourself or for your other teammates or for developers at large.
Yeah. Okay. So keeping things a little bit more simple, a little bit more approachable. What are something else I didn't hear of when I was first learning RxJS was hot and cold observables. I don't know why, if that's normal. Maybe that was different from my learning, but what are they and how do they work? What's that about?
It's a really good question, because now we have to start reaching for things off the shelf that I said we weren't going to touch. And those are things like subjects. And so subject is a class that extends observable, and subjects are kind of a special type of observable in that they do a thing called multicasting, whereas observables are unicasting. And this gets into the topic of hot versus cold observables. And honestly, it's sometimes it's really tough to wrap your head around it. I'll do my best to kind of explain hot versus cold, and then we can touch on unicast versus multicast as well. Okay. So there's a couple different kind of analogies that I use, but I think this one will be fun. So let's say, my wife's name is Bonnie. And for those in the Angular community, not Bonnie Brennan, she's BrianLove. It's a different Bonnie, different person. There's not a lot of Bonnies in the world, but
it's true. It's a good name.
It's a good name. It's a very pretty name, you might say. Yeah. And so let's just say that my wife is a cold observable. So my wife is in the living room, and let's just say I'm upstairs in our bedroom. And so if my wife is a cold observable, once I come downstairs and say, "Hey, how's it going?" She's got something she wants to tell me, and she's gonna say, "Oh, hey, you're here. I'm gonna tell you this now." And so she's quote unquote, she starts producing a value when I subscribe, when I'm ready and able to listen to her. So that's kind of a cold observable, and then I'll get into this a little bit more technical, but that's a cold observable. A hot observable would be if my wife is downstairs in the living room and I'm upstairs in the bedroom, and she's just talking, but I'm not getting anything because I haven't subscribed. I can't hear her. I'm upstairs in the bedroom, but she's just downstairs blabbing. She's just going at it. And so she's talking. And so I then at some point come downstairs and I'm like, "Oh, hey, I'm here." And I can now hear her, and I'm subscribed, right, if you will, or I'm observing. Now I start receiving those values. And so the production of values is not related to the number of observers, right? And so you might think in that second scenario, my wife might be seen as kind of like crazy. Why would she just be talking to herself? And for what it's worth, I tell her that I use this analogy in some of my classes, and like the tech side of it, she's just like, whatever. And she goes, she said to me, she's like, "Well, as long as I'm a hot observable, that's all I care about." That's all I care about. Like, okay.
Tell her you are always a hot observable.
So the technical answer to the question is the production of values occurs outside of the subscriber. So that's kind of the technical answer. So I'll say it again. So an observable that produces values outside of the subscriber is a hot observable. And a cold observable is an observable that produces values as a result of a subscriber. And so you'll see that sometimes in maybe code that you're working with or something like that. From another technical example of that is if you think of like if you use NGRX or something like Redux Observable, you usually have what's called like an action stream, which is like a long-lived observable that is producing values that's emitting kind of actions or notifications of actions. And that kind of occurs whether or not that people are listening to that stream or not, whether there's any subscribers, it's always producing those actions, or your app is producing those actions as a result. And so that's an example of like a hot observable, like in your code, if you're using NGRX and you ever use the action stream.
Okay. And then you said you were going to mention something else.
Right. So then we have to talk a little bit potentially about subjects. And so when we get into, now that we understand like hot versus cold observables, now you kind of bridge that a lot of times into understanding what unicast and multicast is. And so in unicast, observables are unicast by default, and each subscriber owns the execution of that observable. So if you've got a cold observable where the production of values occurs within the observable and it's unicast, for every observer or subscriber, you're producing that value every time because each subscriber or observer owns the execution of that observable. Whereas if you use something like a subject, or you use an observable that's multicasted through a subject with an operator like share or share replay or the connectable or the connect function and things like that, then you're using a subject, and a subject will multicast. And what that means is that production of values will only occur once, and it is multicasted or sent. Every observer receives a copy of that production of values. And so they don't own the execution of the production of values. So it's important to kind of understand both these concepts together. Sometimes when you get into the nuance of RxJS, just so if you have a cold observable and you've got like 5 subscribers, that means you're going to produce that value 5 times. And so that could be a network request that you're going to create 5 network requests or something like that. If it's sometimes it just doesn't matter because maybe the production of values is really small and fast and who cares? And so if you've got a cold observable and you're unicasting and you've got 100 subscribers to that or 100 observers, who cares? It's super fast and it doesn't matter. But if the production of values is expensive, like a network request, You don't want to do like 100 redundant network requests with a cold observable. So that's where you get into using a subject to do multicasting. So that way, every observer just gets a copy of whatever was produced, or reference to whatever value was produced.
Yeah. Okay. I love what
That
you've
was a
done.
lot. I'm sorry.
Well, no, but this is what I love about your teaching, and something I really want to make a point on is that you used an analogy that took us out of the complexities of RxJS, and it made it something that was relatable. And I think when we're talking about, especially these topics that are more difficult and hard to wrap our minds around, when the teacher is teaching, giving us these new concepts and ideas to learn, when you bring in relatable concepts, it makes it so much easier to actually learn, right? Like, I may not understand all the terminology and vocabulary that you're using, but I understand hot and cold Bonnie, right? Like that makes sense to me. And being in a room upstairs and having someone in a room downstairs and not hearing them when you're in a different room, but understand, like, hearing them when you're in the room. Those are things I think that are really important when you're learning these things. And
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
the more we can create these analogies, these comparisons, these stories, I think it's really important for learning and making understanding happen. But
I agree.
the other thing, though, I really wanted to like put another pause and stop here is we've brought in a lot of new terminology, terms, vocabulary. What do you think are like those fundamental terms? And this was actually a point that Deborah Kurata made in the episode I've done with her, where we were just simply talking about Angular in general. And she said, it's amazing to me how many people don't even understand the fundamentals of JavaScript. And here they are trying to understand Angular.
Yeah.
And she said they're not getting frustrated with Angular, they're getting frustrated with the JavaScript, and they don't understand that. So along that same line then is like, are there concepts and vocabulary terms that you would say are absolutely essential before anybody just goes and dives in with RxJS? What do they need to know first and foremost?
Yeah, I think we've covered a couple of them, but let's kind of recap and make sure that we clarify if necessary. And so again, back to our analogy of like a promise either resolves or rejects. So if you take your knowledge of a promise and transfer that to an observable has what are called notifications. And those notifications there's three different types of notifications. There's a next notification, which is akin to resolving a promise. There's an error notification, which is similar to or akin to rejection of a promise. And then there's that completion notification that we talked about. So I think those are kind of just understanding that an observable has notifications. There's these three different types. And then the next thing we need to bridge into is this idea of observing or subscribing to an observable. So we've kind of thrown around that term a bit. But like we said, observables are most likely asynchronous in nature. Put a little asterisk there because observables can be synchronous. But in order to kind of start listening or observing or subscribing to an observable, we use a method called subscribe. And then on that subscribe method, you can either pass it an observer, or you could just give it a callback function, kind of in order, those different notification types. So I think it's kind of important to understand that you have this concept of an observable. It has notifications that are of three types. And to be notified, I need to start subscribing or observing that observable. So we'll use the subscribe method to do so. So there's that concept of, I've got this observable, I need to subscribe, and then I'm going to get some notifications out of it.
Okay.
So I think those are kind of the initial kind of terms that we need to understand.
Okay.
So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, definitely. And then dig in a little bit more on that subscribing. Like what does it mean exactly to subscribe and unsubscribe? And well, then I have a question after that as well.
Yeah. So the analogy here is, as JavaScript developers, if you're writing any sort of like jQuery or just like vanilla JavaScript, anytime you want to be notified of something that happens, the user, like an interaction in the browser, you use what's called like adding event listeners. So if you've got a form and you want to know when the user submits the form or when they click on a button, you add event listeners to that form. Now in Angular or React, we've kind of abstracted that out a little bit, which is nice. But in just kind of vanilla JavaScript, you just call a method called add event listener. And then you say, hey, I want to start listening to this event and I want to be notified when the user interacts with my application. And then I'm going to do something as a result, whatever that is, submit the form, send off a request or whatever, or navigate to somewhere. And so we have this concept of adding event listeners, and you can think of that as subscribing. I'm saying, hey, I want to know when these things happen. I want to know on this button, tell me when the user clicks on it. And then you give it a callback function. That's just kind of the way the asynchronous code works in JavaScript. And that function will be invoked every time that event occurs. So if we take that analogy, kind of take that knowledge, bridge that over into RxJS, when I subscribe to that observable and I listen to next notifications, I'm then going to give it a callback function that's going to be invoked every time a notification is, or a value is produced, or next notification comes through. Now, we also, you mentioned unsubscribing. So to folks that maybe have used just like vanilla JavaScript and have added event listeners, I remember very early in my career, like I would just add all these event listeners and I'm like, great, my app is working. I'm awesome.
Yeah.
And then somebody came along, I don't know who, or I read something and they're like, oh yeah, you got to you have to remove those. And I'm like, what? Why do I have to remove them? I don't care. I just want to listen to the button click. And then I'm going to do something else. And they're like, well, what the thing you got to understand is because you're still listening to that event, like garbage collection, which is like the magical thing that happens to like clean up memory in JavaScript, is that because there's like this thing still listening to it, it can't remove it. And so it like lives in memory still, is called a detached DOM element. And the problem with that is like, it's not a big problem actually. Like, I mean, I wrote apps and never removed event listeners and we shipped them and and they got the job done. But like the technical problem with that is that you've created what's called a memory leak. And so if that's something that you're concerned about, back in the day, you would have to say, okay, I'm going to keep a reference to that callback function. And then I'm going to call remove event listener and say, hey, stop listening to clicks on this button. I'm all done. I'm finished. I'm moved on. I'm good to go. I don't need to know about this anymore. And as a result, when garbage collection comes through, it'll say, oh, this thing is just living with nothing pointing to it. I can go ahead and put that and trash that, if you will. And so for back in the day with like multi-page applications, or MPOs, as I like to call them, like it didn't matter because the user just browsed to the next thing and like, who cares what was happened in the previous page? But these days, for the most part, we write single page applications or SPAs. And so the user is like living in a browser tab for maybe minutes, hours, or even days, right? And if you've got all that memory just building, that might cause a problem over time. And so that's why we have to clean things up, if you will. And so just like removing event listeners, when I subscribe to an observable, I have to unsubscribe and I have to say, I'm done. I don't care what happens in that, like, I'm out of here. I'm going to unsubscribe or stop observing. And that's an opportunity again to improve the kind of the performance and the memory footprint of your application.
Yeah. Okay. Now this is where, oh, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
I was just going to add a quick caveat. Like if you're wondering like, oh crap, I never unsubscribe, like my app sucks. I'm just going to give you an out right now. It's fine. Like I can guarantee you I've written apps where I haven't unsubscribed from every observable and those apps are making money. I made money. It's nice. Living, breathing. And maybe somebody like we all like don't aim for perfection always. Something I have to tell myself. And so it's okay. If you don't unsubscribe from an observable, I promise you, you're not going to get fired, hopefully. It's not the end of the day. But like from a technical standpoint, you do want to remove those event listeners. And like I said, and unsubscribe from observables. And it is more important today than it was in years past because we're building these single page applications that users might stay in for a long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was going to say, like, we could keep digging in on this. This is where it gets hard running this kind of series, because I want to dig into, well, there's multiple ways to unsubscribe. How do you know when
There
to
is
use one? But
yeah,
I'm going to leave that as a challenge to the viewers, is be
Yeah.
aware that there are multiple ways to unsubscribe, and
Yeah.
go do some research, go find out when you would want
Yeah.
to use which one, and
Yeah.
do some research on your own. But one thing we commonly see, not commonly, but like all the time when you're using RxJS, is the $sign.
Oh yeah.
Right. Make sense of that. What is the $sign? Why do we use that? Yes.
I don't know. I don't know who started the $sign thing. Was it Angular? I don't know if it was somebody on the Angular team. I don't know who we could point the finger at here. Whether you love it or hate it. Maybe this is like my Tailwind thing. Like things we should stop doing is like debating suffixes. So I don't know where it came from. And a lot of programming languages, I remember when I learned like C and stuff, some of my teachers, not all, but some of my like professors, like for a string, you would do like str first name, str last name. And if you had like an array or maybe like a vector or something like that in C, you would do like arr users or whatever it is. And so the reason for that was, I don't know, like we were programming in dumb terminals at the dawn of the century. And so it was so you could like mentally note that like this thing is special. Like it's an array of users, or it's a string that's the first name or a string that's the last name. And so like that's like an example of like prefixing your variables. And so it's just kind of a mental note. It's just kind of like a little reminder of what it is that you're dealing with. Yeah. And this was before, like, in my opinion, this was before editors were really powerful and you could just hover over it and it would tell you, oh, this is an array of user objects or whatever. Like you're just like coding in Notepad or Vim. And so, along comes Angular and maybe some observable things. And I'm not sure where or who, if it was in the docs or like, I don't know who we would kind of point to, but a common pattern in Angular, at least, and I don't know if this is the case if you're using RxJS outside of Angular, which you can use RxJS in React or Solid.js if you wanted to, or something like that, or Quick or Svelte. Probably not Vue, but you could. But a lot of times people will suffix the variable name with a $sign to kind of signal that, hey, this is something special. So if I have like users $, like that's an observable that's going to produce a user objects, an array of users or something like that. So it's just a common naming pattern. You don't have to, you can do it or you cannot do it. You don't have to. I think that's really more of like a team decision. Like as a team, if you guys want to, everybody use the $sign or don't use the $sign, or maybe just whatever, don't, either way is fine. But yeah, so it's just kind of a naming convention.
Yeah. Okay. Then again, like I could keep digging into some of these, like what's a pipe and other questions like that. But I think what I want to ask instead, I think for the sake of time here, is like we've mentioned, like you've taught a handful of these workshops, and I'm sure you've had tons of questions asked during these. So what are a couple or some of the most common questions that you've been asked during the workshops? Like what are those biggest gotchas and tripping points that you see that are just, they happen again and again? You keep having people ask you time and time again.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I think I'm trying to think, like probably one of the most common questions, there's a lot of great resources on this. But one of the most common questions is kind of when to use what operator. And to focus a little bit more on that, probably one of the bigger questions is, kind of when to use which like higher order mapping operator. So we've mentioned them already, I think, merge map, concat map, exhaust map, and switch map. And so there's kind of some ways to think about that. But I think that's usually a pretty common question when I'm teaching RxJS. Once we get into those operators.
Yeah.
So it's, again, I think Deborah Kurata did a good talk on this. You've already mentioned her. I think she did a great talk on it. I don't know what conference it was at, but maybe it's on YouTube, where she kind of explains each of those.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to explain without like looking at code, but really it comes down to basically concurrency and cancellation. And so I would just kind of say to the listener, like, go look those up, check them out. And it really has to do with whether or not you want cancellation and whether or not you want concurrency. And so there's kind of a decision based on that. But I would say probably the default should be, so if you're ever wondering, this is kind of like the short answer. So if you're ever wondering like which one should I use, just go for concat map. Like, don't worry about the other, like, if you want to learn about them and learn about the cancellation and all of that, but concat map is kind of the safest. The only potential drawback with concat map is a thing called back pressure, but concat map you don't get any sort of cancellation, and you don't have to worry about like concurrency, and so it's the safest one to choose.
Okay. I think it was, I'll find the video and put it in the notes to this video here, but I think it was Deborah Kurata's talk, the conference right before COVID.
Was it 2019?
I think so.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was that or one of the Enterprise NG conferences. I know that she gave a talk on that specifically, just talking about like breaking down each of those and kind of some of the timing and the cancellation around those. So
it was like she was on stage, and wasn't it like the I always pictured like the Ghostbusters, wasn't it that one? And she was comparing it to like the stream of
I think you have a better memory than me. Was it Ghostbusters themed? I don't remember, but I know that it was I watched it live, so you're right. So it must have been pre-COVID.
Okay. Yeah. I'll find it. But okay, so cool. So that's one of the more common questions you get asked. But let's talk about like on the job then, because you mentioned even yourself when you were learning RxJS, you had some buddies and you guys kind of had like this safe project that it wasn't for your job necessarily. It was just more of like, you could take your time and, play around with it, but not everybody is in that situation. Like they might have to be learning it for their job. And in that case, are there situations or like just different projects you can think of that would be a good way for people at work to be getting comfortable with RxJS?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly I would guess it would be an Angular project where you're already using kind of some observables that come back as part of the API of Angular. And I think in general, like my recommendation would be is just take it easy and take it slow and just take it one piece at a time. Don't worry about building some NGRX effect with, 20 different operators and massive amounts of timing and buffering and all of this kind of stuff. Just take it one piece at a time. You certainly start with, you're making network requests, you're getting observables back, and just kind of start with that. And then if you need to, on that network request, if you need to start doing things like mapping values or plucking values out of the response or filtering or something like that, then you can really start just like take what you already know, which is like array methods, like filter, reduce, and map, and then just start applying those to your RxJS observables, because you'll see that there's a lot of overlap. And I think you'll be able to start grokking some of the way that observables are similar to kind of like an array just over time. And you can kind of start playing with them that way. Okay.
And then let's kind of, I want one more question before I ask my last question here. And what I'm curious about is, at what point do you think it's best for someone to start learning RxJS, like in their career? Do you think doesn't matter if you're advanced or if you're junior, just start learning it because there's no better than today, like day than today? Or do you think for junior developers, maybe delay a little bit, What do you think?
Yeah. I think the answer here, at least this is just obviously an opinion. But if you find yourself, if you love Angular, or you really enjoy the way Angular works and the syntax of it and how it behaves and the templating language, and you're really just drawn to Angular in general, then RxJS is likely going to creep into your life one way or another. And so, as you're kind of starting out learning Angular, again, just kind of bridge that knowledge from promises and event listeners into the concept of observables and some of the operators around observables. And just start learning it slowly, kind of lean on what you already know, try to build that knowledge up, certainly reach out to your colleagues if you can. Pair programming is great opportunity here. Attend workshops and that kind of thing. I think there's so much good content online, but sometimes like self-study is really hard for some of us. And so like sitting down for 4 hours and like doing an online course through whatever, Udemy or what have you, or whatever, Coursera, like that might be really challenging. And so maybe look to get somebody to help you through that process with an interactive in-person workshop or online through Zoom, but where you can actually like ask questions and get clarification. And sometimes that's helpful just to like have somebody kind of hold your hand through it, because it can be very challenging. Now, if you, on the other hand, if maybe you have a current job where you're doing Angular, and let's be honest, like some people just don't like Angular, and that's fine. And you're just kind of like, I really like React and functional components, or solid JS is sweet, or whatever, Vue is awesome. And you don't think you are going to like kind of continue down that path, and you don't see the use for RxJS, then no sweat. Like learn enough to kind of get your job done today. And it's possible that, as you move forward in your career, you may never use RxJS again.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it kind of just depends on your personal preference. I think some people are really drawn to RxJS because it's really powerful and they just want to really learn it and understand it, which I would say, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. And then that leads into the last question I have, which is just simply like, what final thoughts or suggestions do you have if someone is really struggling with it, or just not sure if they even want to learn it, but what are just some final thoughts you can share as your last comments here?
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I think, taking a workshop is a really great way to learn RxJS. And if you've got a team of people that want to take a workshop, I know there's companies out there that will offer you like workshops and kind of come in-house and help teach you. And I think that's a great way to learn RxJS, certainly if you're kind of struggling. But at the end of the day, I think, RxJS is just like kind of any other tool that we have at our disposal. And if it's not the right tool for you, then don't worry about it. Like there's other things you can write really fantastic apps with just promises, and you can still ship them and be fine. And you can write really fantastic apps with RxJS and create really amazing flows and data transformation through, we've talked a little bit about these operators, through piping and the pipeable operators, and create these really sophisticated, elegant solutions. And if that's something you want to do, like aim for that and start learning RxJS as best you can. Yeah, and then I think the last thing that let me throw out a quick suggestion as kind of a final thing. So once you get into RxJS, and if you are at a place or in your team, you're writing unit tests for RxJS. RxJS comes with a kind of a built-in way to do unit testing called the test scheduler, which is very powerful and great to use, but it's also really cumbersome and hard to use, especially when it comes into writing what are called like marble tests, where you're writing these strings that represent an observable or subscriptions of observables. I think my last kind of pitch is like, don't use the test scheduler to write unit tests unless you're creating what are called custom operators. So if you're creating your own operator, which you can use in the pipe function or by using kind of a higher order function, then lean on the test scheduler. Otherwise, just don't touch it. It's it's awesomely powerful, but it's hard to use, I think, at least for me. And I think there's some great options out there. And I would recommend Shai Resnick, who's kind of well known as a testing guru, specifically in the Angular community and beyond. He's got a great library. And if you Google for it, it's called Observer Spy. And I think you have to put like Observer Spy JS, because otherwise you'll get some weird results from Google. But if you just Google for Observer Spy, he's written this really nice this really nice library for doing testing with RxJS streams that is going to make your life so much better.
Nice.
And so if you are doing any sort of unit testing, Test Scheduler is great. I recommend just only use that for custom operators. Make sure that you have good unit tests around those. But if you're unit testing things like NGRX effects or kind of observables in your components, and you want to write a unit test around that, I think the test scheduler is a little perhaps overkill, whereas Shai's Observer Spy library is really fun, easy to use, and you can just, again, kind of get your job done and feel good about, you've written a good test, and you know that you've got it covered. So reach for that. I think that's a great library. So I would throw that out as a recommendation.
Okay. Well, perfect. But I feel like I understand RxJS better. So
hopefully,
other
yeah.
people do
I hope
too.
this was helpful for everybody. I know it's a heady thing, but don't stress out about it. And again, if you have to use first value from or last value from, and you just want to get a promise back from your observable, I promise you, from my perspective, it's cool. It's all right. I'm not going to reject your PR just because that you just wanted to use async await, get a value and put it in the template and display the user's first name. Like that's perfectly fine. Like don't worry too much.
Cool. And then if you do want to learn it though, again, I'm going to give a plug again to Brian's workshop. It's coming up at ng-conf 2023. Please go take it from him. He's great. Like you can see here, he's no stranger to teaching the subject, but he has great analogies and just concepts that make it more approachable. And I think it's always more fun to be there in person as well, and just have people who are there together with you, and that live pair programming kind of idea. So definitely it's on the ng-conf website already. Just go to ngconf.org. Should be right there on the workshop page. But then also don't hesitate to reach out to Brian on Twitter. You can get him at Brian_love. And it's just BRIAN_love. He'd love to connect with you there. He has his Live Love app website. Brian is a consultant. And so if you'd like to, connect with him and talk to him about doing some consulting with your company, I'm sure he'd love to talk with you there. But again, thank you so much, Brian. It was so much fun to have you. And everybody, we'll see you on the next episode. And thanks for being here.